So Sean, big fan of your work, and like um today I kind of want to ask about like the aerobic or like energy system for training. But first of
Mm.
all, like can you introduce yourself for the audience?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and chat. I feel very grateful and have loved watching your YouTube videos, which is fantastic. And yeah, just appreciate the opportunity to jump on. I won't bore you too much, but I'm based in Adelaide, South Australia. I've been involved in the S&C industry for probably the better part of almost 13 years now, in a mixture of roles, whether that's been assistants or head of high performance. For the vast majority of the early part of my career, I was involved in Australian rules football at different levels. Feel again very grateful that we're able to achieve some success in that area. That led to, I guess, all the while, probably in South Australia, there wasn't a great deal of resources that were provided to S&C coaches on the way up. So I always did some private work on the side. And now currently I work, I guess, almost in between the private and the pro sector. So I do some work with the Australian lacrosse teams, both men's and women's. We've actually today had our men's team land in San Diego for the Men's World Championships. We work in the WNBL with women's basketball, so the top level basketball over here. And also, a private performance centre. We're based out of Port Adelaide. We have been operating for the last 4.5 years and have worked our way up to be opening a new centre hopefully in December. We're going to pick up everything that we have and just move to some more space, which is much needed. So, it's been a great journey. In terms of my accreditation, I did my undergrad at UniSA in human movement. From there, I moved into a master's degree in exercise science at Edith Cowan University in Perth. And I've now gone on to just recently, probably in the last 12 months, achieve my ASCA Elite Level 3. So the goal now is to put my head down and continue to work over the coming years. And I'd love to achieve that master's status, but I know that there's a long shopping list of work ahead of me before we get to that point in time. So, but enjoying the journey, it's good fun.
Nice, nice. Love that. What a strong background you have right there.
Just again, feel very fortunate. It's certainly had its ups and downs. Particularly from I'm sure a lot of S&C coaches have had similar experiences in regards to probably the versatility. Oh, sorry, like the I guess the volatility, not the versatility, the volatility of the industry. There have been circumstances where because of COVID, we've lost roles, for example, and clubs have had to tighten up their soft caps and as I said, you have to work pretty sort of unusual hours to make ends meet. But in saying all of that, I wouldn't have it any other way. And we've been able to now sort of solidify ourselves a little bit more in the industry and be able to provide for the family, which is sort of always I guess, the number one goal of all these things. So yeah, it's been a great journey, but certainly not all lined with rose petals and gold, mate. It's you just have to continue to accepting those challenges and not look at those setbacks as failures. You just look at those as learning experiences and use them to just enhance the service you're able to provide as a practitioner next time you get the opportunity to.
Nice. So I saw on your Instagram you play a little rugby yourself.
Oh, actually, I am a short, stocky human being, so I am built like probably a rugby player, maybe like maybe a fullback in rugby league. But we do some work with the South Australian rugby teams here. Primarily, our sort of involvement was with the women's state team, and then more recently, we had a wonderful opportunity to get involved in what they call the combined affiliated states. So what happens, all the best players, what we find over here in Australia, particularly in rugby league, is that the eastern states are really strong and the rest of Australia really lags behind. We find that probably New South Wales and Queensland, they're the two big dogs that provide pretty much most of the talent for the country. So the combined affiliated states is essentially South Australia, Northern Territory, Victoria, WA. They bring all their best talent together to form teams that will hopefully try to challenge some of those bigger eastern states. So what happened more recently, I was the S&C coach for the CAS team. They came over here and they played a bit of a curtain raiser. this curtain raiser was, I guess, the best young talent out of those states that we just talked about. Out of that game, we'll select the top probably 20 players, and those 20 will now go on to play against some of those bigger states. They played a curtain raiser to the State of Origin game here. State of Origin is pretty massive in Australia, no matter whether you're from Northern Territory, South Australia, WA. You still get heavily involved in watching Queensland versus New South Wales sort of crash into each other. And I tell you, having come from again, my apologies to those. I did say to Eric at the start before we started recording, you might hear some little kids in the background, the juggle of having a 3-year-old and a 7-month-old as well, but that's okay. That's sort of, the reality of what we've got going on too. Having come from an Australian rules football background, a lot of people say Aussie rules footballers are tough, which they absolutely are, but there's nothing that can replicate the sound of 230-kilo blokes crashing into each other. I found that the toughness of those rugby players is next level. So no, a very long-winded answer. I don't play rugby, but I've worked in it in South Australian rugby league in particular, and have so much respect for them as athletes too. My sporting career was more, again, in the Aussie rules realm, but finished reasonably early up when I realised that I wasn't going to make a living out of playing.
Nice. So, I want to ask a question not for like not for the sexy part of like SNC or like the most like the most catching eyes. I'm gonna ask stuff like, how would you like? What is your approach to like training athletes' energy system or like conditioning for your athlete? I know there's some like metrics like max, MAS, or like anaerobic speed reserve. So can you like explain what is MAS?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess just to give you like the textbook definition, MAS is the lowest possible speed in which an athlete achieves their VO2 max. I guess there are some pros and cons, and I was really excited to talk about it when you did reach out, and obviously you did sort of touch base and say that you wanted to skew our chat towards energy system development, which is fantastic. What I want to say, like, it is really, really widely used in current best practice, and I know some wonderful practitioners. Some of the very best practitioners in the world use MAS as, I guess, the tool for increasing a person's aerobic capacity. But in saying that, I also want to be very transparent in saying that I don't think it's the be all and end all. I don't think it's the only tool that we should be using to elicit an aerobic response. Just like anything that we use in the S&C world. Let's say, for example, if we go back to a gym perspective, triphasic training is wonderful, but we wouldn't use that for all strength power gains. And there's a number of sort of different examples in that sense that we could utilize. I guess one of the best analogies that I did here, we're very fortunate to have a bit of a relationship with Darren Burgess. For those who follow along, he's based here in South Australia and is the high performance manager at the Adelaide Crows at the moment. And he sort of used the analogy of a car. So, he said, for example, if we refer to an athlete as a car, their engine essentially is their aerobic capacity, their fitness, and their chassis or the body of the car is their anatomy. MAS is very good at enhancing an engine, but might not particularly be as good at improving the chassis as well, because we're not, exposing the athletes to those top end sort of speed exposures that potentially they might be undertaking in a game. So really important to make sure that if you are prescribing MAS conditioning, that it needs to be married up with or coupled with some form of speed exposure as well. I think from that perspective, probably yes, absolutely. There have been times where I do use MAS, and I think one of the great things about it is super measurable. It's really easy once you go through a testing protocol. You can see where people sit straight at the start. So, based on their results, you might be able to say, I'm going to do some 15-second efforts, and you should be doing 70 meters, you should be doing 90 meters, you should be doing 100 meters. That's really good. I guess cons are, probably some of the things that we have seen is that from a tactical coach's perspective. So let's say, for example, you have a head coach who is looking at your athletes. And let's say, for example, if we do you know much about Australian rules football? Have you watched much of it at all, or
No, not
do you?
really.
No, that's okay. Let's say, for example, let's say soccer. As an example, let's say we've got three midfielders. So we know that when we get into the weekend, those three midfielders essentially they need to be undertaking a pretty similar demand. You know, like let's say, for example, there's an expectation that they need to be covering X amount of kilometers and an X amount of high speed and those sorts of things. When a head coach looks at those three players, let's say, for example, that they've scored three different scores in an MAS test and they are doing three different distances, it can be quite confusing for the head coach to look at that and say, well, how come athlete A isn't doing as much as athlete B and C, but he's also playing the same position as them on the weekend? So, and then I guess there's also the conjecture from the athletes that they look at others and say, well, why am I working harder when I actually am achieving better results? So I do understand that. I can also see the flip side of the coin in regards to S&C coaches and sports scientists saying, well, we want to make sure that our athletes are running with good technique, and then if we push them beyond their max aerobic speed, that they might start to run with poor technique, and in turn will start to enhance their risk of injury and those sorts of things too. So it's sort of this fine battle that we're working with the science and then also just the logistics of sport and different stakeholders when it comes to prescribing and looking at it from a training perspective as well. I think from my perspective, I've come full circle in my S&C career. I've talked about the fact that I started about 13 years ago, and I did come from the club that I both played and worked at. Did have a bit more of an old school approach. The more is better. You guys just got to keep going, keep going, keep going. So I sort of grew up with that and had a little hint of that in the early stages of my career before I started to truly have an understanding of energy system development and neurological fatigue and those sorts of things too. Then probably in that midpoint, when I started going to Edith Cowan University, and I had lecturers and tutors like Greg Haff, for example, who's a super smart guy. They really hammered in the fact, they were all about anaerobic capacities and almost were like, do not do anything that's more than 30 seconds because that's a waste of time. And, sports, athletes will never undertake an effort consistently for 30 seconds. So all of a sudden you start going down this path of thought. Now, probably as a more measured and a more experienced coach, I probably see a bit of both. I understand that primarily in most team-based sports, and probably most sports in general, apart from endurance-based sports, that those anaerobic and repeated speed capacities are primary, and that you should make sure that you are enhancing those as best as you can. But also understanding that it's the aerobic capacity or aerobic abilities that underpin the recovery behind those. So it is finding that balance and putting all these pieces together. As we said at the start, I know it's such a boring answer, but you almost need, a little bit of all those things. It's everything in moderation. Everybody wants, that magical pill or that magical training principle that will fix everything, but making sure that you put all these pieces together in sort of the right context. So when it comes to my application, I've certainly utilize that a number of times. I think what I like to do is look at positional demands for sports. So let's say, for example, lacrosse at the moment. Essentially in lacrosse, it's a field-based sport. You have attackers, you have midfielders, and you have defenders. What we find is that your midfielders, they actually cover less distance than attackers and defenders because they primarily work the middle part of the field or the pitch. But their high speed rates are much higher than attackers and defenders. We find attackers and defenders, they tend to travel more. They have a greater transition up and down the field. But because of the grinding nature of what they do, they don't necessarily cover as much high-speed distance. So we look at what's the worst-case demands, what are the worst-case scenarios, and we try to prescribe our conditioning around those worst-case scenarios. So exposing our athletes to, building up to progressively, let's say, 150% of their in-season weekly demand. We try to do that at some point in the off-season or the pre-season, and then taper up and down from there, depending on how much time we have to work with, for sure. That can be a mixture of, flat-out sprints, tactical and game work, and certainly some, I guess to an extent, a modified version of maximal aerobic speed running as well. Sorry if I just burst out I could talk about these topics forever. So please, Eric, tell me just to be quiet if you need to interject.
No worries, man. I love that one. I love that one. So just uh, besides like MAS, is there other like tests you're gonna do to like just to make sure your athlete like what state is it? Is it like unfit or like right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've probably seen again a number of different tests across the journey that all can provide you with the ability to prescribe MAS. Probably what I've seen, and this is absolutely a generalization. This is not sort of every circumstance that I've seen, but more naturally, I've seen in those court-based sports, basketball and tennis, example, we start to see things like bead tests, yo-yo tests implemented. Obviously, for the change of direction nature of it as well, which is really important in those tests, which almost takes in, obviously, when you are utilizing those tests, you need to make sure that you do use calculations that will factor in those changes of direction. They're usually pretty easy to find. Lots of great resources from a theoretical point of view. I love reading articles on places like Science for Sport or Sportsmith. They're all wonderful resources and have really great information and some great articles. I have no affiliation with them at all, but I certainly respect what they do. In the rugby example that we talked about before, rugby league, just because there's lots of normative data on it and because it is a validated test, we use the Martin Boucher 3015. I know that the guys over on the East Coast who are I guess the top dogs when it comes to prescription of conditioning and setting standards for the rugby league athletes that play for Australia. They use 3015, so we utilise that just to keep in line with their standards. And again, there's calculations you can utilise from there. And then probably from there, like more of your open field-based sports, so your football and soccer, for example, we see a lot of like timed or distance tests. So it might be a 5-minute run and you're trying to achieve as much distance as you can in that 5 minutes, or it might be a 1,200 meter time trial, and where simply you just look at how much distance is covered in how many seconds, and then it gives you a meters per second from there, and you can sort of prescribe upwards. In terms of the prescription of it, again, there's not a one size fits all approach, and lots of people will work in different ways. But as a generalization across the board of the different sports that I have seen, often we do see a periodization in short bursts in which you might start with some longer intervals. Week by week or session by session, we see those intervals starting to get shorter and shorter. And often I generally see the gold standard ends up finishing up with a 15 on, 15 off, 120% MAS sort of is generally the gold standard, I would say, is what I see sort of people utilizing in that sense too. So hopefully that helps out. So again, there's no right or wrong answer as long as you can implement a test that number one you're able to prescribe off of. So again, I've been guilty of in the early stages of my career, in particular, implementing tests for the sake of testing. So really making sure that you actually utilize the test for a reason as opposed to just point A, point B. And then just consider what are the demands of your sport. If there is a greater aerobic capacity, then feel free to do a linear, straight line, or circular or square motion where you just go for time or distance. If you are on court, then maybe XL and DCL are greater of greater importance to your athlete's physical capacity. So add in a yo-yo or a beat test in there for sure, or tie it back to whatever has the most normative data or whatever has been validated in your field. I think if there's a validation, then absolutely you can go for it for sure.
So, kind of want to like dive into like the thing you mentioned. Since it's like we're gonna analyze the position demand or like the sport demand, can you like for because you also work with like basketball player, right?
Mm.
So can you like give us some example about what if for like different position in the let's say basketball they have like center, they have power forward, small forward, and guards. So in
Yeah.
these three categories or like four categories, how would you program it for just their conditioning?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and something that certainly is developing over here in Australia. I know for a long period of time, Australian basketball has probably been under resourced, but certainly I'd probably say in the last 5 years in particular, I would say it's almost probably the fastest growing sport in Australia. I think the accessibility of it and also the pathways that we're starting to see now in regards to seeing more Australians over in the NBA, which is really exciting. Um, so I'm going to be completely transparent here. Say, for example, we work in the WNBL, which is the top league in Australia for women. We see that there's only two clubs that currently have GPS units. Obviously, GPS units are quite interesting in an indoor setting. I did do some assistant work for Nick Richardson at the 36ers the year prior as well, and we were just collecting data because we did have the opportunity to utilize GPS units there, but we probably didn't at that point in time have a great deal of idea as to how we could utilize that information, as opposed to a distance or high speed, for example, that we would get in an outdoor field-based setting. Really the only two metrics that had any value at that point in time were player load. It was just an arbitrary player load that was calculated off of the distance you traveled, the number of change of directions and impacts that you had. Obviously, the player load per minute, I guess, was off the back of that, and also the number of jumps that were conducted. We found that guards usually had a greater player load than our bigs for the fact that they probably do move around more. Obviously, bigs do have a reasonable amount of impact, but generally they might sort of push to a certain position and be a little bit more stagnant than a guard might be, for example. But in saying that, talking to and somebody who I would highly recommend you guys go and follow or get in touch with is a guy called Nick Popovich. He's been involved in a lot of success at the Sydney Kings, at Melbourne United. More recently, he headed over to USC in the States and now has just come back to work at Adelaide 36ers as well. I sort of reached out to him maybe, I reckon, 6 to 12 months ago to ask him to be a mentor, having moved into this basketball space as opposed to more field-based settings that I've been traditionally working in. And he was really good and very transparent with me in helping me to contextualize how we utilize those player loads. So what he would do, he would look at how much player load each of his athletes or the positions that he worked with would accrue in a game. And he would then periodize his training loads around that. So usually he would do high days and low days, for example. And there were circumstances where a player would potentially get more minutes because of a change in sort of tactics, and that would lead to an increase in player load. And from there, they would then sort of reduce that person's training load throughout the week. When I first jumped on board with the WNBL crew, we essentially just used playing time as our metric. So time on court. And we would try to mix that up both between sort of pure conditioning sets and I guess tactical and scrimmage sessions too. So knowing that we wanted to get our athletes physically capable for 4 by 10 minute blocks of really high intent work, we wanted to try to I guess structure around that, understanding that the girls would never play 40 minutes, but if we could get them really highly competent at that volume of time under a number of different sort of stimuluses, then that would hopefully set us in good stead to be able to run out games really strongly. So it probably wasn't the perfect method, but was what we have access to at that point in time. Moving on into next season, we are hoping that we can get a sponsor on board in regards to getting some GPS units on board through Catapult, and from there being able to structure our loads a little bit more purposefully, I think, as opposed to just looking at timeframes. Timeframes can be great because that's what we have access to, but also outputs in those timeframes can be quite different depending on what is the makeup of the training session is and those sort of things too. So I would say it's definitely a developing area, but utilizing player load is the way forward at this point in time. I know, for example, over in the NBA, talking to guys like Alex Moore, who's back over here with the Illawarra Hawks now, and guys like Nathan Spencer, who's over back here in Swiss. I did my ASCA level 3 with Nathan, and he provided us some great info, as to what the constraints are in the NBA. And really, those guys probably don't do any really, real structured conditioning work specifically because of such an intense schedule. And, I remember at one point he said they only got to do, I think it was something like 16 gym sessions in the scope of 6 months. So, really the load management perspective is the higher and higher you go up, the more and more intense that sort of traveling and playing demand is. And really they get their exposure to conditioning in game. So your goal as an S&C coach is to control whatever you can control in training too. So again, probably a long-winded answer, and there wasn't probably a really finite, answer provided in that. But I think player load would be what we prescribe off of if you have access to GPS units for sure.
Nice, nice. So, does the how does GPS help you monitor athlete fatigue or like their change of direction in the field and their playing minutes or the accel decel?
Yeah, so probably from a field-based point of view, if we have the access to have live data, those catapults, then certainly you'd be looking at, I know, meters per minute and high-speed meters per minute. That helps you to decipher, for the most part, fatigue. So it's important to make sure that even when you are looking at the GPS data, that you have to have a critical mind as well. You could be looking out let's say, for example, if you're tunnel vision and you're looking on the GPS, on the laptop, and you can see the GPS units and numbers that are flashed up on the screen, and you see that player A, his meters per minute and high speed meters per minute have dipped massively. Then you also need to be looking out in the field as well to say, well, what is the gameplay like? You could say, well, you give a call up to the coach's box and say, player A, his numbers are down quick, let's get a rotation. That might be viable. The other thing is you might look out in the field and see that maybe that player A is a forward, but all of the gameplay has been down in your back half, and actually he's just not getting anywhere near the ball. So in that sense, it's probably silly to utilize one of the rotations that you have. So you always have to make sure you marry up the numbers that you see with things that are happening on the field. You can't just always rely on those numbers because it can be heavily dependent in that circumstance as well. I probably haven't seen accels, decels, and change of direction utilized to make decisions on rotations or player management to this point in time. I'm sure there probably are sports that do. I know that, for example, soccer, again, it depends on which literature you read, but it can be up to 12 times more accels and decels than Australian rules football, which is pretty significant. So I'm sure that they take that into consideration. But probably with the experience that I've had so far, I'd be lying if I said that we utilise change of direction or accels, decels to monitor. I'm sure probably as technology gets better and as science continues to go further down that rabbit hole, then we might be able to contextualise it a little bit more. But I certainly probably wouldn't have the confidence to make decisions based on those numbers yet. But certainly the two big ones that I see would be meters per minute and high speed meters per minute as a bit of a best practice at the moment and those sorts of things too.
Love it. So kind of want to go back to the list I sent it to. Is do you think there are basically speed and power coaches or performance coaches nowadays, they're more gonna utilize high intensity interval training or HIIT.
I know you mentioned that anaerobic speed reserve as well.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. Yeah. But what do you think that we should do you think that is there a place for long and slow and low intensity conditioning work stands?
Yeah, potentially. I think as long as you can contextualize it, I think maybe in the really early stages of an athlete's off season or pre-season, I think building that, there's nothing wrong with building that base as long as the volume of what you're prescribing is appropriate to what their chronic loads are like. I would avoid doing those sorts of things when you're in the midst of preseason and there's lots of volume being conducted in, tactical and skill training, whatever that might be. I think maybe, if the athlete wants a bit of a change up in the off season and you prescribe them some low and slow stuff, there's probably no harm in that to an extent. I guess probably on the flip side of that, you need to just make sure that you're not overloading too much on those sorts of things for the fact of, if we're talking about hamstring fascicle lengths, for example, there's some research to say that slow running does shorten your fascicle lengths, and which is problematic in terms of, injury prevention from a hamstring perspective. So again, the other thing as well is that, and this is just purely from anecdotal evidence, again, talking to the likes of guys like Darren Burgess. We ran a course recently, and one of our participants was the sports scientist for the GWS Netball Club and AFLW Club. And he sort of asked why there are so many calf injuries in Australian rules football at the moment. And Burjo sort of seemed to suggest that a lot of that sort of low and slow or more middle distance running seems to have a greater load on the soleus, which potentially could be problematic, for a load management and injury point of view as well. So, look, I can't say that I've prescribed a heap of it, to be honest with you. But, as long as you can contextualize it, and as long as you can provide an idea as to why you're doing that, then I don't see a massive harm in it, but it has to be the right place and the right time for sure. But probably we're seeing that, more and more phased out as we go.
Cool. So next thing I want to ask is there's also a topic about anaerobic speed reserve. What exactly is that, and how is it different with like maximum aerobic speed?
Yep. So essentially, your anaerobic speed reserve is the difference between your MAS and your maximum sprint speed. So you've obviously got the smallest or the lowest amount of speed that you need to achieve your VO2 max, and also your maximum sprint speed you can sprint at. To be honest with you, for a long period of time, I wasn't really sure what to do with that information. I knew of it, and I probably didn't utilize it more. But the more and more that we start to delve into theory and learn from some of those gurus, and let's say for example, like look at a lot of the information, the articles and resources pumped out by Science for Sport and Sportsmith, I've probably been able to contextualize it a little bit more. I'd be lying if I said that I had utilized this very frequently, but it's something that I would like to delve into a little bit more. Essentially, do you know what I mean when I say the dynamic strength index, like the DSI? So DSI, just for those who are watching, if you're not too sure, is getting a ratio of your strength to power. Often, I've utilized things like the peak vertical force you're able to produce in a counter movement jump on force platforms in relation to the peak vertical force you're able to produce in an isometric mid-thigh pull or a belt squat isometric or something along those lines. In the same sort of vein, you can find a sort of like aerobic to speed ratio utilizing your anaerobic speed reserve. So if you take your maximum sprint speed in kilometers per hour and you divide that by your MAS in kilometers per hour, that'll give you a ratio, usually somewhere between 1 and 2, for example. So if you score above 1.90, this is what we call like the speed reserve ratio. Essentially, it means you've got like what they call like a speed profile. So that might indicate that you have a greater volume of fast twitch muscle fibers, that potentially the training you've been doing has elicited greater speed outcomes, but maybe you're lacking or your aerobic capacity is a lot lower. If you score somewhere between 1.0 to 1.80 to 1.89, then you've got a bit of a mixed bag of lollies. You're right in the middle there. You could probably focus on some more concurrent training. If you score below 1.70, then it sort of shows that you're an aerobic profile. So I think the great thing in that is that can help you as a practitioner. And much like the DSI can tell you whether you need to do more plyometric training or more strength training or more concurrent training. This profile, where in terms of finding your speed reserve ratio, can figure out whether you need to be, let's say, so if you have a sprint profile, obviously dependent on the sport that you're playing, you might, as a coach, and again, there's no right or wrong answer, but as a coach, you might think, okay, well, our sprint ability is really great. Maybe I need to build your tank a little bit more. So you might skew some of their training more towards aerobic capacities potentially. Maybe like we want to highly specialize in sprint speed. I'm just talking from an example point of view. If you score in the middle, then concurrent training, do a nice blend of both. And then conversely, if you're an aerobic profile and you're a team-based athlete, well, maybe we need to keep working on that sprint speed as well. So that has helped me finding that sort of that speed reserve ratio. So taking your anaerobic speed reserve and dividing that by your taking your max sprint speed, dividing it by MAS, and then finding that score will assist you in not only sort of just deciphering where you're at any given point in time, but might help to skew the volume of work you do in different areas for sure.
Cool. So, do you like does do you think that like coaches should like follow these kind of like these kind of metric or these kind of data? I know at the beginning you mentioned that now you probably more individualize your programming for like conditioning. So like let's say if performance coaches now are able to like use Catapult or like use GPS, do you think there's a place for like MAS or like speed reserve ratio or like anaerobic speed reserve?
I think there's definitely a place, but I think it's utilizing the metrics that you are given and figure out how that's going to fit into your program. So, for example, if we look at that speed reserve ratio that we just talked about, and if you have somebody who is high in the sprint profile but lacks a tank, potentially MAS would be a really appropriate intervention for them. If you had somebody who scored in the aerobic profile, maybe adding more aerobic work to them isn't going to be as beneficial. So I guess it probably, at the end of the day, comes down to how much time and what is the level of professionalism of the athletes that you work with. There might be circumstances where you just actually need to work on the lowest hanging fruit. So we might say, okay, we're working with semi-professional athletes. We probably need to just generalize our sporting positions. So let's say, for example, I know in America, lacrosse athletes are professional, but in Australia, they also have to have jobs as well. So probably our goal is what the lowest hanging fruit there is to look at what are their positional differences and try to achieve those worst case scenarios. If you're then working in an AFL environment, okay, we have these guys 7 days a week for 8 hours a day in preseason, then we can actually start to individualize a little bit more. So we can start to say, maybe you're looking at individual game data that collected over a number of years. Maybe not. If you don't have that, then you're looking at these quadrants. So you might have athletes, for example, who if we're talking strength power focus, if I deviate a little bit too, you've got the quadrant that they put together where you've got strength and length, or strength and power, for example. You might have some guys that are strong and powerful. You might have guys that are strong, but they lack a bit of speed. You might have guys that are fast, but lack strength. And then you might have guys that are slow and weak as well, which is like that, in the quadrant of doom. So then that's when you can start to make those individual adaptations as you go. So it does come down to, number one, what's the constraints you have to work with as a practitioner? What is the level of athlete that you're working with? I would also say as well, what is the type of sport that you work with? So let's say, for example, if we're talking about basketball, which you've talked about, does maximum sprint speed, is that really important to try to enhance in a basketballer? You could argue for or against it. You find that the court is usually 28 meters in length. Are they ever going to achieve their maximum sprint speed on the court? You could probably argue potentially not, but acceleration and deceleration for them is like super, super important. So again, the beauty of this industry is that we still don't have the perfect answers yet. And I think it's really important to have lots of practitioners that come together and think differently. Creates wonderful debate as long as you all present that and accept that in the right manner. And then from there, you utilize both the theory and anecdotal evidence that you've accumulated over time to form your own opinions. and create prescription that you think is appropriate for your athletes. And then from there, that there sort of has that snowball effect, because then you start to collect more anecdotal evidence, and that can help to refine as you go. You might say, this works fantastically, or it doesn't. So yeah, it's I've probably sat on the fence with that answer there as well. But I guess we're still far from perfect as an entire industry, and there should be context for most prescriptions or principles, as long as you're able to justify why it's in the program.
Nice, love this. So, can you like give us an example about like how would you prescribe a conditioning workout for, let's say, a lacrosse player? How would you use the MS and anaerobic speed to prescribe a program?
Yeah, so in that context, because they are non-professional, I probably haven't done any of the anaerobic speed reserve stuff for them. But to an extent, I have dabbled in MAS for them in some circumstances. So essentially, how we structure that for our lacrosse athletes is we're in a unique situation as well, in which we have a contingent with me here in South Australia. We have a contingent over in Victoria. We have a contingent over in WA. And we also have a contingent over in America as well, who come over and play lacrosse in the States. So if you think about, we have multiple positions, we have lots of different athletes, all undertaking different schedules based on whatever their clubs are undertaking at that point in time. The challenge for myself was, well, how do I unify all of these together? Essentially, what we've done is that we've given them a guideline, and each week I put into their team builder a target distance and target high speed that they need to try to achieve for that week. They each have GPS units. So what will happen, whether they're playing a game, whether they're doing a field, like a tactical training, or whether they're going for a run, they will wear their GPS units at all stages, and they will collect all their data over the week. If they have achieved the target that I've set for them, that's perfect. That's all great. They're good to go. They can put their boots up for the week. If they haven't, then they need to go out on the Sunday and go and conduct a top-up run. Now, I've provided them with lots of different ideas of top-up runs based on how much distance they have to catch up on. Generally, that will start with some speed work. And then from there, we do break it up. But there's obviously zone 6, which is our top-end sprint speed. And then we do have zone 5 running, which I think is really important as well. We set those at particular meters per second. So for me as a coach, I know what we're trying to elicit. So let's say, for example, you are down, let's just say, so it's easy for context. Let's say, for example, you're down by 900 meters in your zone 5 running for the week. So we know that we need to do 900 meters of top-up running. And that top-up running, we would like to be done at 5.5 meters per second. So we break that up into smaller blocks. Let's say we're going to do 300s. You would take 300 meters, you divide it by 5.5, and that will give you how many seconds the athlete needs to try to achieve that running in. So that's almost like a bit of MAS in itself. So that essentially, so you imagine that, let's say, for example, we've got the guys in South Australia, they're training twice per week and playing a game. So they might achieve their distance and not have to do any running. We've got the guys over in America who might be doing 2 trainings per week, but it's not season over there. So then they need to do lots of top-up running. We might have WA who have got a public holiday, so there's not a training session, so there might be one. So regardless of all these different circumstances that our athletes are in, they end up at the end of the week all achieving the same distance and the same high speed based on whatever their position is. So I'll often give a number for our attackers, a number for our defenders, attacker for our midfielders, so that we can be confident that when we come into training camps together, whether that's for selection, or whether we're heading over to a tournament, for example, like the men at the moment who have just landed in San Diego, we can be confident that everybody is on the same page. We don't have some athletes that are overcooked, some athletes that are undercooked, and some that are somewhere in between. So it's really important so there has been a level of education and a level of trust that has been put into the players in order to make this happen, because we are dealing with so many moving parts. But generally, when you get athletes that are representing their country, and when we have portrayed to them how important it is to be able to conduct this work in order to gain best results, both for themselves individually and as a country, buy-in has been pretty good. So we're looking forward to seeing sort of how we track over the sort of the next coming month as well. So hopefully it gives you a bit of insight. So not much anaerobic speed reserve for those guys, because I don't get to see them face to face, but certainly distance targets, and MAS to top up based on whatever their sort of individual circumstances.
Nice. So last question before I let you go, okay? I know there's gonna be like uh coaches or like working like rugby, working like basketball teams, and they're like starting players for like basketball player. They're gonna probably play a lot of minutes.
Mm.
So and in the rugby, there probably also be some players they're gonna be playing tons of minutes when they're in the game. So I know there's going to be some top up for those who underplay or they don't have enough minutes. But for those who already played a lot in the game, do you think they they still need like uh conditioning work?
That's a great question. So, for those players that don't play enough minutes, absolutely. That's something that's been a big step forward in probably sports science and load management over the last, again, 5 to 10 years, I would say. And I would say that most professional sporting organisations would implement top ups. Let's say, for example, with our WNBL basketballers last year, those who didn't play very many minutes, we put together a bit of a menu, to be honest with you, because what I wanted to try to do for them specifically is to try to make it a bit more interesting than just going for a run. The biggest challenge with implementing top ups is that it's already quite demoralizing when you're sitting on the bench and not getting many minutes. And then when you're there after the game and all the other players are recovering and you're running up and down the court, for example, that's a pretty tough circumstance to work in, and trying to get great outcomes from those athletes can be mixed, obviously, depending on their mindset. So what we try to do is break it into a menu. So the first 5 minutes of our block of top up is a conditioning drill. The next 5 minutes, we might do some form of scrimmaging if we can. The next 5 minutes is more conditioning. The next 5 minutes is, it might be individual, we call it indies, like individual skills. So for a guard, that might be, for example, like working off a screen and trying to drive to the bucket for a layup or something like those along those lines, or for a center it might be like posting up on somebody or something along those lines, and then transitioning up the court. So we try to get the balls involved and break it up into that. And generally what we do is we'll just top up the number of minutes that they missed out on for the average of their position. So let's say, for example, the average of their position is 25 minutes. If they played 0 minutes, they do 25 minutes of top up. If they play 5 minutes, they do 20 minutes of top up, and so on and so forth. So the goal is to try to that was from that perspective. I know, again, from a field-based perspective, they're a lot more precise in distance and volume and that sort of stuff too. I see in AFL settings, they might have a kick and a catch at each of the quarter breaks, so they're still getting some skill work in, and they stay ready to go. And then from there, they might be doing some sprints up and down the ground at the end of the game quickly, while their teammates are going through their post game review and those sorts of things too. So yes, top ups are definitely something that should be implemented, and it just makes your job easier. For example, because there are if you were to not do those top up minutes or those top up distances, then you have to take those into consideration when you are moving, into training blocks in the next 2, 3, 4 days. You've got some athletes that are going high load, some that are going low load. If you've just got the consistency across the board, and it gives you confidence as well that it's like the next man up scenario. Let's say, for example, touch wood, you never want that to happen, but one of your starters injured themselves. You should have confidence that those backup players or those bench players have the minutes under their belts, so that they're going to perform and not going to be cramping in the last quarter if they haven't played a game for the first 10 rounds.
Nice, nice. So that's kind of all the question I have for you today.
Awesome.
So
Hey, thank you so much for the opportunity to be involved. And I thank you for everybody for dealing with the background noise of my kids as well. Hopefully that's been good to distract you from my annoying voice. But as I said, it's the beautiful thing about juggling work and a family as well. So I'll go back and go help out my wife with the kids. She works lots harder than me at home here. particularly when I'm out with athletes too. So thank you to everybody for listening.
No worries, man. So for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
Yeah, so feel free to reach out. So my personal social media is at s.c.baker. That's on Instagram. I use my LinkedIn a fair bit as well. So Sean Baker, Sean Baker. And also my private performance facility is Peak Performance, but that's spelled Peaq Performance at Peaq Performance. And that's an acronym. It's not that I couldn't spell properly. It's an acronym for periodized, evidence-based, applied, and qualified performance. So I've spat
Nice.
that one out a few times. So any of
Nice.
those, feel free to reach out. Always happy to collaborate or answer any questions that you guys have, and always open. I love working and networking with new people too. So very grateful for the opportunity, mate, and looking forward to more chats to come.
Cool.